There aren't many television shows that tickle my pickle like Better Call Saul.
It's showtime, folks.
Beyond being a spin-off to one of television's greatest dramas, Better Call Saul is a richly textured character piece that follows a morally conflicted con man who slowly succumbs to his destructive addiction that tragically affects himself and the people around him.
The big question of this show is, how does a decent guy become dead inside, at least morally?
For the past 7 years, Peter Gould, Vince Gilligan, and their brilliant team of writers hit me with a devastating tiger drop and beat me senseless. After a great deal of sock puppet therapy, here I am making a video on one of my favorite pieces of television. The tragic journey of Jimmy McGill from a morally conflicted lawyer into a morally flexible criminal was heartbreaking to say the least, but what made it even more devastating was knowing that he was fated for a life of loneliness. In his new life as Gene Takovich, is it Takovich? Whatever. Jimmy's devoid of being a colorful showman, and he's reduced to being an agitated doormat who longs for his glory days in secret. And in the series finale Saul Gone, he was finally forced to unpack his feelings in a way we've never seen before. I personally love the ending of the series, but I've seen some people on the Better Call Saul subreddit who don't understand why Jimmy does what he does in the finale. So, for my own sanity and for the sake of those individuals, I've risen from my crypt to explain how this ending makes sense for Jimmy McGill and for the series as a whole. In order for this deep dive to work, I'll be spoiling the absolute living shit out of these two shows, so if you haven't seen them, I suggest you leave now. Or, if you got some low-hanging balls and simply don't care, then by all means, stick around. Before we go any further, shout out to you guys for showing major support on my first video. I really appreciate it. The current channel goal right now is 1,000 subs, and we're nearly halfway there, so do the things the algorithm likes, and let me know how you feel about Better Call Saul in the comments below.
But what I know for sure is that the law is too important to be toyed with. It's mankind's greatest achievement. The rule of law, the idea that no matter who you are, your actions have consequences.
In the eyes of Chuck McGill, his brother Jimmy could never change. Throughout his life, James Morgan McGill couldn't help himself from getting into trouble, and every time he tried to go straight, he inevitably slipped back into his destructive habit. Driven by a desperate need for love and validation, Jimmy becomes a lawyer to gain his brother's respect, and he sets himself on an honest path of reformation. His older brother Chuck, however, refused to believe that his crooked brother was genuinely capable of change, and he could never wholeheartedly accept him as a lawyer. The main thing that Chuck lives for is the law, and he loves it so much he does whatever he can to uphold it. So if someone as deceitful as Jimmy could become a lawyer, then how sacred could the law be? Jimmy, on the other hand, had actually changed since his Slippin' Jimmy days, but Chuck refused to believe in him, so Jimmy stopped believing in himself. Throughout season 1, Jimmy can't help himself from coloring outside the lines, but despite this, he still tries his hardest to live the life of a noble lawyer. He could have let those skaters be skimmed by Tuco, or he could have even let Nacho rip off the Kettlemans. But he didn't. His humanity prevented him from fully slipping back into his destructive habit, yet his toxic relationship with his brother is the driving force that pushed him back into a life of scheming. Only after Chuck's betrayal in season 1 does Jimmy start to embrace his true nature as Slippin' Jimmy, and he stops bending over backwards to please his older brother. Instead, Jimmy starts living for the one person in his life capable of giving him the love and support he so desperately craves, and that's Kim Wexler.
I know he's not perfect, and I know he cuts corners. But you're the one who made him this way. He idolizes you. He accepts you. He takes care of you. And all he ever wanted was your love and support. But all you've ever done is judge him. You never believed in him. You never wanted him to succeed. And you know what? I feel sorry for him. And I feel sorry for you.
In order to cope with painful moments in his life, Jimmy often engages in acts of chicanery to distract himself from facing his true feelings. In comparison, Chuck too carries a lot of emotional baggage that he refuses to unpack, and as a result, his internal feelings manifested into a physical illness. Both brothers have their own unique way of coping with their sadness, however they share the same defense mechanism of erecting walls. To remedy the pain of his so-called condition, Chuck would wrap himself in a mylar blanket, aka a space blanket, as a way of suppressing the pain from electromagnetic fields. In reality, the space blanket was Chuck's way of coping with depression, and it helped him suppress the past trauma from his divorce and his inferiority complex about his brother. As Jimmy continues to engage in acts of chicanery throughout the show, his unhealthy coping mechanism eventually manifests into its own metaphorical space blanket named Saul Goodman. By shrouding himself in Saul, he doesn't have to think about the most painful parts of his life as Jimmy McGill, and instead he continues the fun and games of being a criminal lawyer. There were many moments in Season 6 that reached into my chest and ripped my heart out, but nothing f***ed me up more than the hard cut of seeing the Saul Goodman we recognize from Breaking Bad emerge in full.
Walt's a big boy, he'll turn up.
Mr. Goodman, clearly something is going on here. I mean, why would he leave his car in my driveway?
People carpool to work, right? It's good for the environment.
He carpools. He carpools to his job at a meth lab.
Hey, whoa! You're breaking up there.
In the grand scheme of things, I get why people would be upset that we never see Jimmy truly transform into Saul, like by getting Dr. Caldera's notebook, his Cadillac, or even how he gets the Statue of Liberty inflatable from the Kettlemans. The truth is, these things are superfluous in the big picture. The moment where Jimmy sounds like he's being internally torn apart, juxtaposed with the hard cut of him waking up as Saul, was all the proof we needed to know that the transformation's been complete. The minute he opens his eyes, Jimmy flattens himself into a two-dimensional cartoon character hell-bent on making millions to fill the void of being alone, as well as a way to distract himself from all the tragedies he's lived through. By becoming Saul, Jimmy retreats inward and puts on a happy salesman mask to mask the pain of losing everyone he's loved, and in the process, suppresses the nightmares from his encounter with the boogeyman. By fully assuming the role of Saul Goodman, Jimmy keeps a lid on his emotions, knowing he'll never have to unpack them anytime soon. In the series finale Saul Gone, Jimmy finally unpacks those emotions and redeems himself in the eyes of the one person he has left. But first we gotta talk about Gene.
From here on out, I'm Mr. Low Profile, just another douchebag with a job and 3 pairs of Dockers. If I'm lucky, a month from now, best case scenario, I'm managing a Cinnabon in Omaha.
If the black and white imagery didn't make it clear, or the melancholy music, then let me remind you that working at Cinnabon is a prison. No disrespect, Mr. John Cinnabon. Jimmy's bleak existence as Gene was internally destroying him because he was forced to color inside the lines and play it straight. However, when his miserable life was threatened by a cabbie with 2 faces, he handled the problem the only way he knew how. Hot take incoming, but Nippy is undoubtedly one of the greatest episodes of Better Call Saul. I know.
You need to leave!
But at least hear me out. This episode brought some much needed levity to the series after the previous 2 episodes made me weep like an anime girl. This episode also felt reminiscent of an episode from Season 1, but more importantly, Nippy gave us a glimpse into Jimmy's soul, and showed us a side of him we've never seen before. As he pours his heart out to Jerry Terry from Parks and Rec to buy Cabbie Two-Face some time, Jimmy dejectedly vocalizes how lonely he feels as Gene, and in the process, shows genuine remorse for his late brother.
I got no one. My parents are dead. My brother. My brother is dead.
The most heartbreaking part of Jimmy's monologue was hearing the sadness in his voice as he could barely utter out the words.
I got no wife.
In addition to his emotional trauma, Jimmy's also a character who has a hard time expressing his feelings, and the only other time we've seen him all choked up like this was during his emotional breakdown at the end of Season 4. As far as that goes, Jimmy's always concealed his true emotions, and hearing him finally vocalize his pain, it got me off.
What? You did? Are you serious? Just during this?
Woohoo! Big time, yeah.
As Jimmy's riding the high of his successful scheme, he goes back to the scene of the crime, aka the department store, and looks at some shirts. Specifically, shirts that Jimmy McGill might wear. And just as he drapes a colorfully muted shirt over himself in the mirror, he slowly realizes he can't be this person anymore. He's no longer Jimmy McGill. He's condemned to live the rest of his miserable life as Gene Takovich, Cinnabon manager, and so he resumes that life. There's no one left in his life that truly knows him as Jimmy McGill. Nobody except Kim. And she's gone.
Everything you're doing, everything you're involved with, that's over.
Just tell me what to do. Whatever it is, I'll do it. No, just tell me what I need to do to change, okay? Just tell me what it is and I'll do it.
Jimmy.
No, Kim, you make me happy.
After reopening a painful wound, Gene slips back into the skin of Saul Goodman following a painful conversation with Kim. In one of my favorite montages of the series, Gene breaks bad by stealing rich people's identities to distract himself from the pain of hearing Kim's voice. Once again, Jimmy's stuck repeating the same toxic cycle because he can't help himself. This montage also makes a point to emphasize that Jimmy doesn't learn from his mistakes, and ultimately, that's his hubris. Despite everything he went through with Lalo, and especially Walter White, he falls back into the same violent pattern because he simply can't help himself. Without love, Jimmy has nothing to live for, and instead of dwelling on that fact, he spirals into the same destructive habits that forced him into hiding as Gene. Following his phone call with Kim, I personally believe that Jimmy was trying to get himself caught, but not intentionally. Subconsciously, he got sloppier because his ego inflated like Heisenberg's. And just like Walter White, Gene broke bad and felt overconfident in his skills, which ultimately led to his inevitable downfall. Therefore, the idea of robbing the guy with cancer wasn't out of greed, but rather out of spite for Walt, because the collapse of his empire spoiled the fun of being Saul Goodman. In his past life as Jimmy McGill, Chuck was the one who made him feel like a loser.
He defecated through a sunroof.
And in season 3, Jimmy projected his hatred for Chuck onto the Air Force pilot.
Because you're an ambulance-chasing piece of shit, because you're all the same. You're the same as always on a high horse, always trying to make me feel like I'm...
Walter White is the same as Chuck in that regard, and once again Jimmy found himself in another toxic relationship where he's treated as less than.
Did you actually just use the word ethically in a sentence? You're not Clarence Darrow, Saul. You're a two-bit bus bench lawyer. And you work for me.
Now, as he's committing identity theft as Gene, Jimmy's projecting his hatred for Heisenberg onto a blameless guy with cancer, and he robs him out of pure spite. Breaking into this innocent man's home puts Jimmy back on Bad Choice Road, and that's exemplified through the juxtaposition made at the end of the episode Breaking Bad. Meanwhile, in the Sunshine State, Kim Wexler has dramatically condemned herself to a painful existence, as a form of punishment for her role in Howard's disappearance. I'm talking Miracle Whip, barbecues, and blank puzzles. Kim's mundane life consists of making brochures for a sprinkler company, and living with absolutely no excitement in her life. As Jimmy invades her joyless life with a phone call, Ray Seahorn's facial expressions say it all. Kim obviously still has love for Jimmy and feels sorry for him, but in her own words, they're bad for each other. Talking to Jimmy is just as painful for her as it is for him, and when she suggests that he turn himself in, it leads to some explosive ramifications for both parties. Kim's constantly dwelled on the horrific deed of tearing down Howard Hamlin, and because of that, she feels like she isn't worthy of more. In her job interview with Schweikart in season 2, Kim says that if she stayed in her hometown in the Midwest, she'd be running the register at a local supermarket or a gas station. So moving to the land of enchantment, aka New Mexico, was Kim's way of seeking more from her dull life. Instead of working towards the things she desires most, Kim settles for less as a way to torture herself. Only after her conversation with Jimmy does she feel sorry enough to atone for her malicious mistake. After she returns to Albuquerque and comes clean with Howard's wife, Kim can't help but show a vulnerable side of herself on the airport bus full of strangers. Almost out of nowhere, she breaks down into an ugly, snot-dripping, heavy crying, showing true remorse for her wicked act of evil. When she returns to Florida, Kim slowly regains her humanity and feels like she can become herself again, and volunteers at a legal aid office doing what she loves most. Gene, on the other hand, is driving over to Marion singing "The Tide is High."
I'm not the kind of girl who gives up just like that. Oh no.
Blissfully unaware that she's already put 2 and 2 together. The end of season 3 told us that the elderly are Jimmy McGill's kryptonite, so in this scene I knew he wouldn't choke out Marion with a telephone cord. But seeing him stoop to that level of scumminess was a shocking development for his character, and even he realized it. After months of evading the police as Gene, Jimmy's finally detained as Saul Goodman and put behind bars. Moving on to the series finale, Saul Gone, a page from the screenplay tells us exactly what's going on in Jimmy's head.
Shit.
Rock bottom. He stays like that for a long moment, and then Gene's gaze lands on something above him. Jagged words scratched into the ceiling. And now Gene does something new and unexpected. He emits a small, sincere laugh. Now here's his face, and he's different. This guy knows the score. He knows exactly what to do. It's halfway to Jekyll and Hyde transformation, because the man in the cell isn't just a helpless felon, he's Saul fucking Goodman. As a fugitive, he was playing a game he didn't know, but now that he's in the system, his system, he's like Kal-El waking up under a yellow sun. In this place, he has superpowers. Saul, let's call him that. That's who he is. Bangs on the door with open palms.
I need another phone call! Another phone call!
Jimmy's idea behind Saul Goodman was to cut corners, defy expectations, and win against the people who thought less of him. For the first time as Saul, Jimmy's slipping back into the skin of a loser to come out on top as a winner.
Where do I see it ending? With me on top, like always.
After hours of negotiations, Saul eventually whittles his sentencing down to merely 7 years, plus a lot of added sweeteners. As he's riding the high over having power over the government, he throws in something he's never disclosed before: what happened to Howard Hamlin. Unfortunately for Saul, they already know about Kim's testimony, and it shocks him because she did what he said. Kim felt so horrible that she had the fucking balls to publicly express her sorrow to not only the federal government, but to the widow of the man whose death she's partially responsible for. And here's Saul Goodman playing the victim to gain a significant amount of leverage before going to prison.
Mrs. Schrader, you are looking at a man who has lost everything. My profession, my family, my freedom. I have nobody. I have nothing.
Kim's noble decision showed Jimmy he could still change, and if he was going to change, he was going to change in front of her. At this point in his life, everything he once owned is Saul gone. The feds seized his money, his business fronts, his mansion, everything. He has nothing left. As Saul Goodman struts down the narrow courthouse halls, he dons a shit-eating grin, knowing very well that this is his final performance. The music mimics the ink spots that we've heard in earlier seasons, only this time the tune is more upbeat as we're reminded that all things are possible, if you only believe. Chuck never believed that Jimmy could change, but Kim did, and now she sits anxious to see what Jimmy will do next. As Saul Goodman is uncuffed and seated next to his attorney, he silently whispers for the last time,
"It's showtime."
The courtroom scene at the end of Saul Gone mirrors the moment at the end of Season 4 when Jimmy faked sympathy for his brother during his reinstatement hearing. Only this time, Jimmy's genuinely ready to unmask himself for the world to see. As he approaches the stand and begins the same victim speech we heard earlier during his negotiations, his testimony takes a wide left turn. He suddenly starts to lament over his greed and reveals that that's what drove him into working with Heisenberg. In his own words,
"That night I saw opportunity. I shot it. Big money."
And Jimmy's always been driven by money.
It's like talking to Gollum. You're transparent and pathetic. You want a handout? Here. Huh? Next time, why don't you bring a tin cup and be more honest?
Saul Goodman always shrouded himself in money to fill the void of being lonely, but now that he's ready to atone, he knows that he'll have Kim in his life, so in favor of love, he gives up the glitz and glamour of being Saul Goodman. As he goes on and on about his partnership with Walter White, Kim sits there stunned that Jimmy's actually laying it all out there, even being so honest to admit,
I lied to the government about Kim Wexler. I fed him a load of BS about her involvement in Howard Hamlin's murder. I just wanted her to come here today. I wanted her to hear this.
After running and hiding behind personas for nearly half his life, Jimmy unveils his authentic emotions for the first time in the courtroom. Even the shot is framed in a low angle to convey that he holds all the power in the room, as all eyes are fixated on him. By far the most satisfying part of his monologue was hearing him finally admit,
What happened to Howard Hamlin? It was... I can't even. After that, Kim had the guts to start over. She left town, but I'm the one who ran away.
meaning behind his Saul persona, this is James Morgan McGill who's finally owning up to the fact that he ran away from dealing with the most painful parts of his life. He also shows genuine remorse for his brother and gets everything off his chest. He even admits to the stuff that doesn't make sense for the public to hear, but for a lunatic like me, it satisfies my soul.
What was all that? That thing with your brother, that wasn't even a crime.
It was.
Mr. Goodman, sit down and stay seated.
The name's McGill. I'm James McGill.
The rest of the room might not know what happened, but Kim sits there feeling relieved that Jimmy shed the skin of Saul Goodman and regained his humanity just like she did. At last, Jimmy's accepted the fact that he's done some horrible deeds, but his past isn't going to determine who he is anymore. James McGill has learned from his mistakes and made a change in his life, even though it cost him his freedom. But in the end, he received the two things he desired most, love and validation through Kim.
If I had to do it all over again, I would maybe do some things differently. I just thought you should know that.
That you have regrets.
Yeah, I have regrets.
A common theme in the finale is the idea of regrets via the time machine subplot. Throughout the finale, we dive deep into Jimmy's psyche to explore moments from his past, and this subplot alludes to the Charles Dickens novel A Christmas Carol, a story about a greedy miser who refuses to change his ways until he's influenced by three ghosts. Similar to Dickens' classic novel, Jimmy's visited by three ghosts who help him come to terms with his regret of becoming a lawyer. Our first ghost is Grandpa Mike, who says if he had a time machine, he'd travel back to the day he took his first bribe, for obvious reasons. Whereas Jimmy says he'd travel to the day Warren Buffett bought Berkshire so he could invest in the past and assume the life of a billionaire. The opening scene of Saul Gone reinforces how shallow Jimmy is with his emotions, and emphasizes how emotionally distant he is compared to other people. Again, this same point is illustrated once more as we move on to the next ghost, Walter White.
You are not talking about a time machine, which is both a real and theoretical impossibility. You are talking about regrets, so if you want to ask about regrets, just ask about regrets. And leave all this time-traveling nonsense out of it.
Okay, regrets, then.
One of Walt's regrets is personified through the watch, as he looks back on his time with Jesse Pinkman and regrets how their relationship fell apart. But his main regret is leaving the successful company he built that's now worth billions. Also, keep in mind that this version of Heisenberg here is also post-Ozymandias, so seeing him settle down and get real with Saul after his entire empire just fell apart is tragic in its own right. Meanwhile, Jimmy feeds Walt a crock of shit after saying his only regret in life was falling on his knees during a slip and fall scheme, to which Walt replies,
"So you were always like this?"
Once again, Jimmy feels the same disrespect from Walter as he once did from his brother Chuck, and when Walt belittles Saul with that one line, it felt like an emotional gut punch from his past that reinforces the idea that he can't change.
You're just gonna keep hurting people?
That's not true.
Jimmy, this is what you do. You hurt people over and over and over, and then there's this show of remorse.
After Jimmy absolves himself in the eyes of Kim, we're transported back into the comfort of Chuck's house lit by lanterns. Chuck obviously is our last ghost, and he is the one who reminds Jimmy, as well as the viewer, that it's never too late to change your path. For Kim, it was never too late to absolve herself. Now for Jimmy, he was always going to prison regardless. The beginning of the show illustrated that Jimmy was sentenced to a miserable kind of life anyway, whether it be in a Cinnabon in Omaha or in a county jail making bread. There was no happy ending for Jimmy McGill, but there was absolution. When James Morgan McGill rides the bus on his way to prison, this scene is cringy as f***, I can't lie. But it does provide some interesting context. Despite reforming himself in the eyes of the law, the general public still acknowledges Jimmy as Saul Goodman. The inmates and the guards call him Saul, even though he tells people,
I'm McGill.
Don't give me that. You're Saul.
It's an interesting dynamic because ironically this is how Jimmy started the show, trying to reform from his past, but people still see him for what he used to be. In the first episode of the show, he looks back to his days as Slippin' Jimmy with fond remembrance, and now when people call him Saul, he can't help but smile for building an identity that everybody recognizes. Also, when people remind him of Saul, he's reminded of the sacrifice he made to get Kim back in his life. And in the end, that's all that mattered to him. With everything in his life being Saul gone, he retained the one relationship that mattered, the one that made him happy in a world that's devoid of color. Kim is also the only person who acknowledges him as Jimmy, not Saul like the other people around him do. Now that she's back in his life, he feels good knowing he has the love of someone who knows the real him. The bittersweet tragedy of the show is seeing how these two deeply flawed characters ended up on contrasting paths, but in the end, wound up on the same path of righteousness. The ending of Better Call Saul was quietly perfect for both Jimmy and Kim, and I believe it was the best outcome for both of them. Obviously, people will have their own opinions on the ending, but this is the one of a crackpot. I hope you enjoyed my take on the ending of Better Call Saul. I've always loved this show for being a meticulous slow burn, and I'd hate myself if I never made a video about it. But I believe I've said enough for one video. Stay tuned and subscribe, but in the meantime, fuck off.